All right, so today we're going deep on potential geopolitical shifts. And I think this is going to be really interesting in the wake of, obviously, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
Mhm.
We're going to unpack an article from Politica, which is a Serbian news outlet.
Okay.
And the title of this article is Britain Has Aspirations for the Kyiv Oblast.
Interesting.
So this piece is speculating about how the conflict might reshape the global power landscape, particularly for Britain. And I think, along the way, we're going to uncover some fascinating historical parallels and some really unexpected players.
Yeah, it's really interesting that this is coming from a Serbian perspective, given their history and ties to Russia and kind of their position outside of NATO.
Right.
It has a really interesting layer to this analysis for sure.
Absolutely. So to get started, this article really dives into the current state of the conflict in Ukraine.
Okay.
And it kind of paints a somewhat grim picture, suggesting that Russia is gaining ground and potentially even close to securing control over these key regions like Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson.
Yeah. And that's led to some, shall we say, creative thinking among some of Ukraine's allies.
Okay.
The article suggests there's been some whispers about potentially dividing the country if Russia manages to solidify its control over these territories.
Hold on now. Divide the country. That sounds like it would cause way more chaos than it solves.
Yeah.
So who's even proposing this and how would it even work?
Well, the article specifically mentions Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, and Romania as potential beneficiaries.
Okay.
And, they all have these historical ties to different parts of Ukraine. So it's not, completely outlandish.
Right. I can kind of see the historical connection there. But then the article throws in this curveball about the Kyiv Oblast. And for those who don't know, that's the region surrounding the Ukrainian capital.
Yeah.
Potentially ending up under British control.
Wow.
That's kind of a wild scenario.
Yeah. To understand why that idea is even being floated.
Yeah.
We have to go back and look at Britain's history and their relationship with Russia.
Yeah.
The article quotes Lord Grenville, a British statesman from the mid-1800s. And he said something along the lines of, Britain's duty is to have possessions all over the world to spread civilization and progress.
Wow.
It's pretty bold stuff.
Yeah, even for that era, that's a pretty bold statement.
Oh, yeah.
So is this article implying that this historical mindset of global influence that's kind of driving Britain's actions today? I mean, they haven't exactly been shy about getting involved in conflicts involving Russia in the past.
Exactly. And it kind of goes even a step further than that.
Okay.
The article actually claims that Boris Johnson, the former prime minister, may have even sabotaged peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine back in 2022.
Wow, that is a bold claim. But if they're undermining peace talks, wouldn't that mean prolonging the war?
Right.
And the suffering in Ukraine?
Right.
What possible motivation could Britain have to do something like that?
Well, they connect this to Brexit, Britain's exit from the European Union, to their historical ties and the current alignment with the United States.
Okay.
And it suggests that, Brexit might have pushed Britain to seek out this more independent role on the world stage.
Okay.
And that role could involve strengthening their partnership with the U.S. while also, pushing back against Russian influence.
So they're saying that Britain might be trying to carve out their own sphere of influence outside of the European Union.
Yeah.
And Ukraine's kind of a pawn in this game.
That's what the article suggests.
That sounds pretty cynical.
It's definitely a controversial perspective, but I think it raises some interesting points about the complexity of Britain's motivations here.
Sure.
And to really understand where they might be coming from. I think we have to look at some historical examples of their involvement in areas where Russia has, traditionally exerted its influence.
So you're talking about things like the Crimean War in the 1850s and their involvement in the Bolshevik Revolution in the early 20th century?
Exactly.
I mean, those were definitely periods of some intense rivalry between Britain and Russia.
Oh, for sure. During the Crimean War, Britain actually fought alongside the Ottoman Empire and France against Russia.
Wow.
For control of the Black Sea region.
Wow.
In the Bolshevik Revolution, Britain sent troops to different parts of Russia to support anti-communist forces.
So this whole Britain-Russia rivalry isn't exactly a new dynamic.
No.
So what about Britain's current support for Ukraine? Are we seeing echoes of that historical competition playing out right now?
The article seems to suggest that, yeah.
Okay.
They highlight the £2.5 billion aid package that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak provided to Ukraine in January of 2024.
Right.
as well as reports of British mercenaries fighting alongside Ukrainian forces.
Okay, so there's definitely a significant level of involvement from Britain, but then the article kind of throws in another wrinkle.
Yeah.
The Trump factor.
Right.
Donald Trump is back in the White House after winning the 2024 election. And the article is suggesting that his focus is kind of shifting away from Europe towards expanding U.S. influence in North America.
Oh, interesting.
Places like Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal.
That's a really interesting development. And it really makes you think, if the U.S. is less focused on Europe, does that leave Britain with less room to maneuver?
Right.
Might they feel the need to be even more assertive in, asserting their interests in the region?
It almost feels like this article is building up to this idea that Britain's kind of filling a void left by the U.S., at least in Europe.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then this whole idea of them taking control of the Kyiv Oblast while still far-fetched starts to seem a little less crazy.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings us to some of the potential consequences of this whole scenario.
Okay.
The article argues that British involvement in dividing Ukraine would definitely increase tensions with Moscow.
I mean, yeah, that seems pretty obvious, right? Russia's not just going to sit back and let a NATO country walk in and take a piece of Ukraine.
Exactly. And beyond, the immediate risk of things escalating in the article, also questions whether the, Ukrainian cost, as they put it, would even be worth it for Britain.
So they're taking on a lot of risk for very little reward.
Potentially, yeah.
Especially if the U.S. is turning its attention elsewhere.
Precisely. And that's where we need to stop and consider what this means for you, the listener.
Yeah, we're talking about potentially redrawing the map in Europe.
Right.
Heightened tensions between nuclear powers, a possible shift in the global balance of power.
And if the article's right, all of this might be happening when Britain's global influence is actually waning.
Right.
So where does that leave Britain on the world stage? What role are they going to play going forward?
That's a great question, and one that we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive. So we've kind of established that this article from Politica is suggesting that Britain might be overreaching a little bit in Ukraine, potentially driven by this desire to hold on to its global influence, even as its traditional power maybe is fading. But where does this leave Britain if this kind of gambit doesn't pay off?
Well, the article argues that, despite this potential decline, Britain's not going to just give up its favorite sport of, meddling in global affairs. It paints a picture of a nation kind of clinging to its past glory while at the same time struggling to adapt to a changing world.
Meddling is a little bit harsh, don't you think?
Yeah.
It makes them sound like some kind of mischievous busybody.
Yeah. I suppose it does come across as a bit cynical.
Yeah.
But, we have to remember this is a Serbian publication.
Right.
And, Serbia, Russia has a long history of being on the receiving end of Western intervention. So their perspective is naturally going to be colored by that experience.
That's a good point. It reminds us that we always need to consider the source and its own potential biases.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, even taking that into account, the article's central question remains relevant.
Okay.
Is the potential Ukrainian cost, as they put it, worth the risk for Britain, especially if the U.S. is becoming, a less reliable partner?
So let's unpack that a little bit. What exactly are the potential costs for Britain in this scenario?
Well, beyond the obvious risk of escalating tensions with Russia, which we already touched on. Yeah. The article argues that the economic and political fallout could be pretty significant.
Okay.
Imagine further sanctions, damaged trade relations, maybe even cyber attacks.
Right.
These are all very real possibilities if Britain is seen as actively undermining Russia's interests.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the potential human cost as well.
Oh, absolutely.
If this conflict escalates, who knows how many more lives are going to be lost, how many more families displaced. This isn't just some geopolitical chess game. It's about real people's lives.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think often gets lost in these discussions about, global power dynamics and all of that. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract. But we have to remember that these decisions have very real consequences for ordinary people.
It is a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder, what's the end game here for Britain? What are they hoping to achieve?
The article kind of suggests that they're trying to cling to, what's left of their empire to maintain this position of global influence even as the world is shifting around them.
But is that even realistic at this point?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The world is changing, and the old rules of power, they just don't apply the way they used to.
So if Britain's traditional approach to global affairs isn't really viable anymore, What are their options?
Right.
What's their path forward in this new kind of reality?
Well, the article hints at a few possibilities.
Okay.
It mentions Britain's need to compete with other European economies, particularly France and Germany.
Right.
And it suggests that, maybe they need to focus more on strengthening ties within Europe, even after Brexit.
So maybe Brexit wasn't the clean break they thought it was going to be.
Perhaps not. It's possible that they underestimated the economic and political consequences of leaving the EU.
Sure.
And now, they might be looking for ways to re-engage with the continent.
It's almost as if they're trying to have their cake and eat it too.
Right.
Wanting the benefits of being part of Europe while also maintaining their independence.
It's definitely a delicate balancing act, and it raises another interesting question.
Okay.
Could this potential shift in focus create opportunities for new alliances or partnerships?
Oh, interesting.
Could we see Britain playing a more assertive role in other regions of the world, perhaps seeking to strengthen ties with countries in Asia or Africa?
That's a fascinating possibility. It seems like those old Cold War alignments are kind of breaking down, and we're entering this period of realignment and uncertainty.
Exactly. And that creates both risks and opportunities, right? Risks because it's harder to predict how things are going to unfold, and opportunities because it allows for these new partnerships and collaborations to emerge.
So for you, the listener, this is all about understanding the bigger picture, the forces that are shaping our world.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about Britain and Ukraine here. We're talking about a fundamental shift in the global balance of power.
And while it's impossible to predict exactly how things are going to play out, one thing is clear: we're all living in a world that is becoming increasingly complex and interconnected.
Yeah.
What happens in one corner of the globe can have ripple effects that are felt everywhere else.
So it's more important than ever to stay informed, to think critically, and to engage in meaningful dialogue about these complex issues.
And to remember that we all have a role to play in shaping the future, even if it's just by, staying informed and being part of the conversation.
That's a great point. So if this Politica article is correct and Britain's traditional model of global influence is fading, what's next? What role do they carve out for themselves in a world that's being reshaped by all these new power dynamics?
Yeah, it's a question that kind of takes us beyond, just this one article from Politico where we're talking about what is Britain on the world stage right now? How do they see themselves?
Right. And I think what's fascinating is that the answer might lie not in, these grand gestures of dominance like they've been known for in the past.
Right. But maybe in a more subtle kind of strategic approach.
You mean kind of playing to their strengths instead of trying to be everything to everyone?
Exactly. Britain still has a lot to offer the world.
Sure.
They've got deep diplomatic expertise, significant cultural influence, and they have substantial financial resources.
Right.
It's about leveraging those assets in a more targeted way.
So instead of trying to project power everywhere, they could maybe focus on specific areas or issues where they can have a real impact.
Exactly. In a multipolar world, influence isn't necessarily about military might or, territorial control.
Right.
It's about building these strong relationships, fostering cooperation, and becoming kind of an indispensable partner in certain key sectors.
So you're saying kind of like a behind-the-scenes power player instead of, like the big dog on the block.
Yeah, and I think that requires a real shift in mindset.
Sure.
It's about acknowledging that Britain might not be the superpower that it once was.
Yeah.
And, embracing a more collaborative approach.
Right. Kind of like humility and adaptability are key.
For sure.
In a world that's changing so rapidly.
Yeah, they need to reassess their priorities, forge these new alliances, and find ways to contribute to global stability and prosperity in new and innovative ways.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity. It's a chance for them to redefine their role in the world, not as this fading empire, but as a vital partner in shaping a more peaceful and prosperous future.
And maybe, rediscovering their own sense of purpose and identity in a world that's, increasingly complex and interconnected.
Absolutely. So I think for our listeners, the takeaway from all of this goes beyond just, the situation in Ukraine or even Britain's role in the world.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we're living in a time of profound transformation. The old rules are kind of breaking down and new possibilities are emerging.
It's a time that demands vigilance, critical thinking, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty and change.
This Politica article has really given us a lot to think about. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future. And, that starts with understanding the forces at play and engaging in these thoughtful conversations about the challenges we face.
We need to ask ourselves, what values do we want to uphold? What kind of future do we want to build? And what are we willing to do to make that future a reality?
Because ultimately, the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create together, through our choices and actions.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity and working together to build a world that's more just equitable and sustainable for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. We've gone really deep on this one, folks.
Yeah, for sure.
We've explored potential geopolitical shifts, historical echoes, the evolving role of nations in a changing world. But most importantly, I think we've been reminded that we all have a part to play in shaping the future. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.